I'd like to talk about mental health in the game industry because this is a topic that often comes up, at least between the lines, but very few people talk about it. And I'm going to start by reading basically an excerpt of an email that was sent to me not too long ago from a student based here in Europe. And basically this is what she said. So, dear Ms. Edwards, last year I attended one of your lectures at our school and you inspired me. As you may have heard, in September, in October, multiple controversies in our industry came up, and this is why I'm emailing you. Within our school, we have a Slack channel that we use to discuss things that are going on in the industry right now. Now, recently, the incidents at Telltale and Rockstar came up. We've gone into a lot of discussion about this and what we need to do about it in our school teams to minimize this behavior. In the Slack channel, we see a lot of "we need to unionize the game industry" messages, and I see a lot of "we need to get out of this mindset," but it doesn't give us anything that we could possibly work with. They are just words. To be honest with you, these incidents worry me tremendously. I'm concerned that when I come out of the university, I will be forced to work many hours crunching, as you see in these incidents, and after all, these stories are not really that uncommon. I fear that while I love video games and I'm passionate about creating them, I will no longer be able to see my loved ones. I'll be forced to work at a company that enforces ridiculous working habits as part of their culture, and I will fall into a deep depression and start hating the game industry and games. As mentioned, we've discussed a lot in our school what we could do, but I'd like to ask, what can we do? What can we, the students of today and the developers of tomorrow, do against these practices? Right now, I am mainly afraid of what future awaits me. It's not the kind of email you want to get from anybody, and I get these kind of responses a lot because I'm out there, I speak at a lot of events, I meet a lot of students around the world, and the concerns that she shared, the reason I shared that particular email is because it pretty much encapsulated a lot of the feeling I hear from students in the industry, but not just students, also people who are in the industry as well. And now, I've been around the industry for a long time. It'll be 27 years as of April, and when I ran the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, for 5 years, one of the first things I did after I left the game industry, not the industry, left the IGDA, was become involved in mental health. Because when I talked to all these people around the world and engaged with them, one of the most common things that I had expressed to me about what's their biggest concern about the industry, it was mental health. It was basically on a very personal level, how is this affecting me as a developer? All of these things that weigh upon me. It's not just the pressures of the job itself, but it's all of the larger pressures around doing the job and being part of this industry and all that entails. And so that's one of the reasons why I joined Take This, which takethis.org deals with mental health in the game industry. Just recently, you may have heard that here in the UK, they have a new organization called Safe in Our World. I just became a patron of that organization, and I'm also involved in the Toronto International Games Summit on mental health, because it's an issue that's very important to me because I see how many people it affects across this industry. The maybe not so shocking reality is that 1 in 5 people this year will be diagnosed with some degree of mental health issue. That can be a wide range of things, from anxiety to depression. Some of it's more obvious, a lot of it isn't, which is one of the reasons we don't talk about it, because if you walk into work on a Monday morning with a broken leg, you get all this sympathy, and people are like, "Oh, can I bring you coffee? Are you okay?" But if you walk into work on a Monday morning and say, "I just don't feel like working today," well, why? Well, I feel depressed. And nobody knows what to say. It's like, well, maybe if you just work hard today, you'll feel better. It's like, that's not an answer. And the shocking thing, too, is that 1 in 2 people in their lifetime will be diagnosed with some kind of mental health disorder. So it's a very prevalent thing, and yet it's a stigma that we really don't talk about very much. Now, what I want to talk about in the very short time that I am here is a lot of what I'm talking about comes out of this report that came out just late last year, the State of the Industry report, which I highly recommend you take a look at on the takethis.org website. And in this report, they outline 3 key factors that are affecting game developer mental health. And this is after doing a tremendous amount of research and doing surveys with developers working in the industry. So the number one issue, which is probably not a shock to you, is the lack of job stability and longevity. Now, when I was running the IGDA, we created something called the Developer Satisfaction Survey, and you can see here that when we ask questions like, why did you want to leave the game industry, maybe it's not a surprise, but by far the largest answer is that I want a better quality of life. And no doubt a lot of us have heard those anecdotes from friends who left because they're like, I love working on games, but, And usually that but is followed by all kinds of reasons why, the pressure, the uncertainty, all of these kinds of things. And then we also ask people, which of the reasons captures why they would want to be self-employed or freelance. And the number one answer there is more control over working conditions, because again, it's something that we find impacts people a tremendous deal. I'm not going to read through all of these stats, but these are some examples of some of the other information that came out of the survey. Like only 46% feel that there's a clear path of advancement. Only 18% receive overtime compensation throughout the industry. Only 18% regularly work 45 to 59 hours each week, which is a lot. It's more than normal. Like that stat, 24% worked for 3 to 5 different employees over 5 years. That's a lot. That's a lot of change happening in your life and moving from place to place, not just as an employer, but actually physically moving to different geographies in that amount of time. It can be incredibly stressful. And so a lot of the stress points that came out of the survey, again, things that are not too surprising to us, of course, having to do crunch and the time pressures, the role of employees on social media. If you happen to be a community manager, for example, and you're expected to be the front line of your company and have to deal with the trolls and everything else, and the companies oftentimes don't really care so much. They're like, well, that's your job. Your job is to deal with that. But if you know anyone who's been a frontline community manager, you know the amount of stress that they've had to deal with when they're dealing with the audience. Competitive workplace, uncertainty around stability, which is a huge issue in our industry, frequent job and location changes. So all of these kind of add up to a lot of the pressures that we have, and undoubtedly this will cause mental health stress. And then, of course, if we talk specifically about crunch, it may be not a surprise either that when we did our survey, the majority of people think that crunch is unnecessary. There's, when we ask that question, and there's all kinds of reasons they give, which we don't have time to go into. What's interesting, though, is when the Game Outcomes Project, which was done about 5 years ago, one of the most interesting finds that they had is that the more that companies crunched, it tend to result in lower Metacritic scores, which is crazy because that is exactly the opposite of what crunch is supposedly trying to do. You're trying to create the best game possible and be successful, not to mention get it done on time, but then the fact that the more you crunch, that actually results in lower Metacritic scores, that obviously says something is broken in that cycle. If you're interested specifically about the crunch topic, I recommend looking at this white paper that came out in 2016 called Crunch Hurt, which is a great overview. It's about 15 pages long, and it talks basically from a physiological and medical point of view why crunch doesn't work for human beings. We as people can sustain about 2 weeks of crunch, and then after that there is basically zero ROI on all additional time spent. And so oftentimes in companies we call those sprints, so they're intended to be quick, like a week or two. That makes sense for human physiology, but beyond that it just doesn't really work. And we know that, we've seen the effects of that, especially on the mental health side. Now, of course, this all kind of leads to another topic, which is unionization. And a lot of times, the opinions on unionization have started shifting quite dramatically over the last several years, as you can see. So this information over the last decade, as we were monitoring this when I was part of the IHDA and beyond, you can see the affinity for unionization has increased. And oftentimes, when you ask people why are they so supportive of the union, it's often because of the work-related issues, and it's because of the impact on their mental health. Now, the second issue that came up in talking with developers is the lack of diversity and inclusion in the company. And this is obviously coming from a lot of people. It's not just coming from people who are underrepresented in the industry, it's also coming from people who are well represented, which means mostly white males. So there's a general sense that they would like to see more diversity and inclusion in this industry because they know that the people who are playing our games are diverse. I mean, we are basically dealing with a ubiquitous audience, and yet those who are making games still don't reflect our audience. So when we ask questions like, do you feel there's equal opportunity in the industry, the majority answer is no, and this comes from a survey that's answered by about 79% white males. And so it's not just the underrepresented people who are expressing this opinion, which I think is encouraging. Or we ask also, how important do you rate the following? So the first question was diversity in general, in any workplace. So 75% felt that that was very important or somewhat important, but in the game industry specifically, it was 79%. So again, we have a huge, strong opinion that diversity is very important, and yet, when we look across the landscape of our companies, a lot of times they're not reflecting that sense. Like if you take the US alone, where you've got 45% of the game players are women, and then you only have 21% of the workforce creating games are women, and so there's a huge disparity there. And I know that was one of the things that I was pushing quite heavily when I was running the IGDA, and ever since then in the advocacy work I do is trying to help people understand that we want those who make games better reflect those who are playing them. And of course there is a gender wage gap that exists as well. This is old data, of course, from the Gama Sutra salary survey, which unfortunately they have not done since 2014. But it helps demonstrate that there is a actual tangible wage gap, and especially is worse in the field of audio, which they found, where that disparity is massive. And then the third issue that is also important to developers, which is affecting their mental health, which I think we've seen more and more today, is the public perception of what we do, of the kinds of things that we do and what we create. When we see things like this, which I know in the US is a very constantly reinforced narrative about how evil games are and how games are the cause of violence. I mean, we just saw what Joe Biden said yesterday, where he called us creeps. We are creeps who teach people to kill. That's what he said. So that's, congratulations, that's what we are now. This is a huge failure of the industry. This is a massive failure on our part. I don't expect that guy to understand what we do. But we as an industry have really failed in trying to educate the public and really be engaging in helping them understand exactly what we do. We see these stories that come out around these issues. I mean, this narrative is constantly reinforced every single time there's a shooting in the US, which unfortunately is like at least once a week. We have these stories come up and everyone's doing the tug of war. No, it's guns. No, it's games. No, it's this, it's that. You probably saw this little chart that was making the rounds on Facebook and social media during the last couple of big shooting incidents in the US. And I mean, it's no secret. It's like, yeah, we have access to guns in the US and it's very readily available. Where I live in Seattle, I can walk, about a kilometer away to a pawn shop and I can buy a gun easily and just walk out the door with a gun. So, because that's how easy it is. What's interesting, though, in terms of the court of public opinion, back in 2011, we had this major victory in the US where the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Schwarzenegger when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California, which is so ironic, and he was suing the game industry for violence. And the Supreme Court of the United States, I know, really? The Supreme Court of the United States said in their findings, these are pretty smart people, they said there's no compelling link between violent games and its effect on children. And that's been reinforced in other studies. And yet, Pew Research Center did this study a few years ago in the US. They found that 40% of adults believe that there's an absolute connection between games and violence. There's no evidence for it, but the narrative is out there in the media. 26% of adults think that games are a waste of time, even though more than 74% of adults play games, which is kind of weird. 60% of people believe that those who play games are mostly men, which we know is not true. And this is really crazy. 23% think that most video games do not teach teamwork or communication. So they've obviously not played any online game. They haven't played any, significant game in the last, 5 to 10 years. So they're kind of out of touch. But my point being is that the narrative in the media is so divergent from the reality of people who play games. And bringing this back to the mental health topic, I talk to a lot of developers who feel this, they feel this pressure when they're doing their work. When they're talking with their family, when they're talking with people in the public, and they say, what do you do for a living? I'm a game developer. It's like, oh, really? It's like you weren't smart enough to be a doctor or a lawyer? What happened to you? And honestly, there's people who think that about game developers. And again, I think it's more of a failure on our part not to be better advocates, both as individuals and as a collective, to explain to the public. For example, when I talk to politicians out there in the world, and let's say they're going to do a policy in their country or their particular jurisdiction around fishing rights. Well, guess what? The entire room is filled with fishermen and people from that industry who are angry, and they've got signs and they're like, don't do this to us. When they propose legislation that might affect video games, almost no developers show up. Now, the trade associations showed up, the lawyers from the trade association, but the government officials are like, well, we expect those people to show up because they're paid to show up. But where are the developers? Where are the people who create the games who actually are going to be affected? And that's our problem. We should show up. We should be more engaged in that. Especially when we realize and embrace the fact that games are the current evolution of human narrative. We are the ones who are currently defining how stories get passed from one generation to another. All these other forms of media that have come in the centuries past, these are all still relevant today, but right now, video games, it's on our shoulders, and I think it's a great thing and a thing to be proud of that we are the ones carrying this. The other thing that's really important too is understanding our economic position. I think most of us already understand this, but knowing that games compared to all the other forms of major media is very significant. These numbers are 3 years old now, so it's actually more than this, but the proportions are still correct. And what's even crazier, when you think about all forms of live sports around the world, like FIFA and the NFL and baseball and all that stuff, you add up all the revenue from all live sports, and we still make more money than they do, which is insane. We're a going concern, and yet I think a lot of times we as an industry think of ourselves as like a scrappy startup, like we're the rebels. It's like, no, we're actually the empire. It's like, we are, but And so one of the things that I think we need to do, and I've actually done separate talks about this topic, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I think it's a real benefit to our mental health as individuals and as a collective if we show that we are proud of what we do and we are willing to display that to the public and willing to stand up as a group and say, I like what I do, I'm happy with what I'm doing, I'm not ashamed of what I do. And I say this because even though you may or may not feel that way, I still meet a lot of developers around the world. When I ask them, like, what do you do? They say, well, I'm just a game developer. And I want to slap them and say, you're not just anything. You are a game developer. It's amazing. So in the typical game development ecosystems that we have, where we have these different players involved, and we have the general public out there who are playing our games, and we've got the non-playing public, that typically they're the ones who are very vocal against video games for various reasons. Could be religious reasons, cultural reasons, whatever. And they're very vocal to like educators and to the government saying, we don't want you to support games, we don't want you to add research money to games and all that. And I basically say we need to just bypass these people and do a better engagement of the game playing public and also help them to be our messengers as well and kind of be on our side. So don't view players just as a monetary source and who's paying your bills, because they are, but they're also partners in our collective passion for this medium. There is hope, as I'm finishing up here. There's a lot of great things that are happening in different companies throughout our industry who are starting to get the idea that mental health is very important, and they're changing their work practices. They're trying to minimize or eliminate crunch. They're really trying to focus on mental health and diversity. So there's a lot of good signs in our industry. We need to see a lot more of this, however, but there is hope, and like I said, there's different organizations that are trying to confront this directly, and I definitely encourage you to support them as well in what they're doing. So there we go. I think I barely made it.
Yeah. Thank you. No, stay. Please stay.
Oh,
I want to just give the opportunity to ask one question.
Oh, yeah.
I know we're tight on time, but I think it would be really nice to just be able to have a question. Do we have any questions?
Any questions?
Yeah? Who's first? Over there in the corner? All right. Here you go.
Great presentation. I was wondering, will your slides be available so we can circulate the message in our networks?
What's that?
Will the slides be available so we can circulate the message in our network?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
That's an easy question.
Any other questions? I think I saw someone trying to. Okay, there we are. All right. Yeah, no problem. Here you go.
Hey, yeah, thanks for that. I mean, this is definitely something that I've been thinking about as well, but, well, I'm not as eloquent as you, so I don't really have a chance of getting this message out there. But the question that I have is actually, how do we actually try to educate developers in order to take care of these things? Because perhaps the problem is not necessarily that we're not going to solve this problem by just telling everyone hey, now change this.
Yeah.
But could it be that the problem is actually more deeply rooted, like education, for instance, right now at the moment? most of the game studies actually base themselves still on textbooks and theories from 15 years ago, which do not allow for a lot of diverse thinking or anything like that. And also, is our society perhaps not ready for this? Because we're still having this, well, when it comes down to diversification on gender, for instance, we still have the idea that, or at least a lot of people still have the idea, why would you as a woman go over into games?
Right. Right.
So what can we do as a society or educational system in order to change these things?
Well, I think, yeah, there's a lot in that question, so there's a lot to unpack. But basically, on the industry side, my answer to that question is basically there needs to be better leadership. And I don't mean replacing the people in leadership. I mean they need to show better leadership on these issues and show that it's important. You know, and because a lot of times, if the leadership of our game companies and publishers and everyone else made this a priority and helped us to believe that they really take it seriously, I think that would help. For like on the mental health issue, for example, if you imagine what would happen if the leaders of most of the major companies, and any company, frankly, actually stated to the company that, you know, I'm really concerned about your mental and physical well-being. I want you to take care of yourself. I'm going to try and minimize crunch as much as possible, and basically made it as part of the company's DNA and state it plainly and keep reinforcing it over time that this is important to me. And not only that, and that they demonstrate it through their own behavior, so they're not crunching all the time either, which I totally understand it's not easy to do, but they have to demonstrate and exhibit the behavior and then keep reinforcing it, and also encourage people within the company to watch each other's backs. You know, so if you see someone, you know, it's like, well, I want to be here and I want to work 18 hours a day. It's like, but it's not good for you. You know, it's like, well, I don't have anyone to go home to or anything like that. It's like, but still, it's not, get a hobby, you know, do something else. This is not healthy. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can do, and I think it needs to start with the leadership making sure that it's important. And the same is true with diversity too. You know, and I have met leaders in different companies in the industry who actually genuinely want to see better diversity and representation in their company, but a lot of them, they don't know where to start. You know, they don't know how to get it moving. And it's like, well, that's fine. There's all kinds of people who are willing to help them out and to give them advice and point them in the right direction. And there's great organizations in this industry who can do that, but they need to avail themselves of it. And again, I think that's a leadership issue. And so from my perspective, that's where I've seen the biggest failure. It's not that the message isn't out there. There's tons of resources on diversity and inclusion and mental health and everything else. There's tons of resources on crunch practices and project management and all that. It's about the companies not willing to engage on it and actually do it. And that's where the failure is to me.
I think that, you know, from my perspective also, I see working in different countries, and maybe there's a cultural perspective of it as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, coming from Sweden, I see one thing, and then I went to work in Germany, I see a different thing.
Yes.
How women are treated, how women are paid, and what's the roles, you know.
Yeah, well, it's like, I remember like when Hannes used to run IO Interactive in Copenhagen, I visited and I was talking to him about crunch there, you know, and he said, well, these people don't crunch because the Danish people are not going to do it. And he's like, I need them to crunch sometimes, but I'll tell them, hey, you need to stay late tonight, and they just kind of chuckle and leave at 5 p.m. You know, because like, oh, that's cute. That's a nice joke. And I love the fact, and what he said then is, as CEO, he said, then I had to adjust our project schedule to adjust to their behavior. Like, that's exactly what you're supposed to do, not the other way around. And I wish more and more companies could do that. And that's one of the things, as a geographer, that's one of the things I've been trying to do in the industry, is use examples like that, take it to places like the US and North America where they still do a lot of crunch, and say, guess what? You can still make great games and you don't have to crunch. There's a way to do it. It's not like it's impossible.
There's also something that when I get asked, you know, the Swedish kind of gaming phenomena, what's it all about? I talk a lot about the culture, how we work.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing is how you lead people, but the other thing is really how does the team work?
Yes.
And that's sort of one really important part of that. They take a lot of ownership, but also expect to be respected back, you know, on their work ethics. Yeah.
Absolutely, which does have a very positive impact on mental health.
Yeah.
So.
Any other questions? No? All right, then thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think